Hi. So far, we have learned all about supervised learning. That is, our training data contains corresponding labels. In this lesson, we temporarily dive into unsupervised learning. In unsupervised learning, the training data have no corresponding labels. We know their points, but we don't know what they exactly mean. That is why in unsupervised learning, our job is to make sense of the data, even though we're not provided with the corresponding labels. This process of making sense of unlabeled data is what we call clustering. The main idea in clustering is to represent each cluster by its cluster center. So let's say we have these points in a two-dimensional space. And then we also have these 2 points, the green and the red cluster centers. Knowing where the cluster centers are, we can easily assign each point to its nearest cluster center. So we can see here that the data points closer to the green cluster center are assigned to the green cluster, and the data points closer to the red cluster center are assigned to the red cluster. Also, if we knew the assignment of points to a cluster, say for example, these points here represent a cluster, we could easily compute for the cluster center. So for this one, the cluster center would be around here. But the challenge is we don't know where to start. We only know the data points, but they have no corresponding labels, so we do not know their clusters. We also don't know the cluster centers. So we have a chicken egg problem here. If we knew the centers, we would get the clusters. If we knew the clusters, we would compute for the centers, but we don't know either. The answer to this chicken egg problem is iteration. So again, let's say we have this training data. We don't know the cluster assignments yet, and we also don't know the cluster centers yet. We start with a guess of the cluster centers. So let's say our red cluster center is here and our blue cluster center is there. So based on those guess, we will assign each data point to its nearest cluster center. So in here we can see that data points closer to the red cluster center are again assigned to the red cluster. Data points closer to the blue cluster center are assigned to the blue cluster. So given the new cluster assignments, we already have the cluster, we recompute for the cluster centers. And so we can see here that the cluster centers have moved after recomputing based on the new cluster assignments. And then from those new cluster centers, since we have these new cluster centers here, we assign each data point to its nearest cluster center. So we can see here that the data points previously assigned to the blue cluster are now assigned to the red cluster, and there are also data points previously assigned to the red cluster now assigned to the blue cluster. That is because the cluster centers have moved. So we repeat this process until we see that the cluster stops moving. So we can see here, we now have this new cluster center here. And then again, we assign each data point to its nearest cluster center until we can see that the clusters are not moving anymore. And when that happens, it is said that the clusters have converged. To give you a better idea of how the clusters converge, I have implemented a simple program in Python to implement the k-means clustering algorithm. So let me just pull that up and run the program. So what it does is first it plots random points in the two-dimensional space, and then it will randomly select 3 points as the cluster centers, as you can see here, and then it will assign each data point to its nearest cluster center. And then with those new assignments of clusters, we recompute the cluster centers. As you can see, they have moved. And then we repeat that process over and over again. For now, it's slow because I set the interval as 5 seconds. But if you can run this again with smaller delay. So there it is. And we can see that the clusters are sort of moving. And the cluster centers will readjust and readjust until it comes to a point that it's not moving anymore. So as we can see here, at perhaps around 10th iteration, it has already stopped moving. So going back to the presentation, as a recap, in this video we have discussed about unsupervised learning, clustering, the iteration algorithm, and also a little bit of a visualization of clustering. And I think that's it. Thank you for your time, and till next time.